When I took the job at the Dunsmuir Public Library, I wasn't looking for anything more than a quiet place to breathe. Life had been folding in on itself. College hadn't worked out. My bank account was perpetually anemic, and I needed somewhere that didn't demand much more than a pulse and some alphabetizing skills. The listing had sounded simple enough. Shelving, checkouts, late shift closing duties. Peaceful, steady, small-town kind of work. Dunsmuir itself looked like a place sealed in amber. Nestled in the hills of New England, it had that postcard charm with steepled churches and hand-painted signs. Time moved slower there, maybe even backwards. The library was no exception. It squatted at the end of Elm Street like an oversized tombstone. Gray stone facade, Gothic arches, and stained glass windows so thick with dust they filtered sunlight into dim, colored beams. The inside smelled like musty paper, lemon oil, and something faintly metallic that always seemed stronger on rainy days. The library didn't get much foot traffic after dark, which suited me just fine. My shifts mostly consisted of re-shelving returns, running a vacuum across worn carpet paths, and checking the locks before heading out at closing. The older staff tended to disappear by 5, leaving me in the hushed company of endless shelves and the occasional student too polite or too shy to be asked to leave until closing time. On my third night alone, something shifted. It was a little past 9 when I saw her for the first time. I was working the circulation desk, half reading a book I wasn't supposed to be reading, when I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Down in the 600s aisle, just past the biographies. There, in the glow of one of the weak overhead lights, stood an older woman. Slim, stooped, her gray hair tied back in a tight bun. She wore a forest green cardigan, ankle-length skirt, and a pair of black orthopedic shoes. She was pushing a cart stacked with books and seemed deeply focused on her task, gently sliding volumes into place on the shelves. Her movements were slow but precise, like she'd been doing it for years. Decades. At first, I assumed she was a volunteer I hadn't met. Maybe someone from the Friends of the Library group who liked to come in and tidy up after hours. It wasn't unusual for small-town libraries to operate like extended families, with retirees dropping by to help out of habit more than obligation. I remember feeling oddly reassured by her presence, like the place wasn't quite as empty as I'd thought. But that night, I noticed something strange. She never looked up, not once, never paused to glance around or acknowledge me, never even seemed to breathe deeply, just that smooth, perpetual rhythm of placing books one after another, some upside down, some in the wrong sections altogether. It was the way she shelved them that first struck me as off. Nonfiction organized like fiction, paperbacks where hardcovers belonged, topics completely out of place. A book on maritime knots next to a volume on prenatal nutrition. A guide to 1970s jazz wedged between 2 encyclopedias about mushrooms. It was like she wasn't shelving based on any system I recognized, just putting things wherever they felt right. I made a mental note to fix the chaos later and called out, thinking she might have forgotten her glasses or misunderstood the labeling. But she didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Just kept on pushing the cart forward and sliding books into place like she hadn't heard anything at all. I took a few steps closer. Still no reaction. I could hear the soft shuffle of her shoes, the faint metal rattle of the cart's loose wheel. But the air near her felt strange, like stepping into a room where someone had just left and taken all the warmth with them. I stopped short and decided not to press my luck. Maybe she was hard of hearing. Maybe she had dementia. Maybe it was just better to let her be. The next morning, I mentioned her in passing during a coffee break. I expected a quick, "Oh, that's just Mrs. So-and-so," or some eye roll about eccentric volunteers. But instead, the room stilled. One of the older librarians, a woman named Marilyn who had worked there since the early 80s, slowly set her mug down. Her mouth pressed into a tight line. The others looked away, suddenly interested in anything that wasn't me. Marilyn didn't ask any questions. She just said one thing. Quiet, measured, final. That was when I learned about Eleanor Voss. According to Marilyn, Eleanor had been a fixture at Dunsmuir Public for over 30 years. She loved the place more than anything else in her life. She'd practically lived among the stacks, often volunteering to cover closing shifts deep inventory days, even maintenance tasks well outside her job description. She knew the Dewey System like scripture, could find a lost book without looking it up, and was known for her peculiar but methodical shelving habits. She vanished in the fall of 1997. Mid-shift, cart full of books, her cardigan hanging on the coat rack in the staff room. No note, no signs of foul play, no body, no trace. The only clue left behind was her cart, parked in the middle of the 300 section, books partially shelved in that same jumbled, chaotic pattern I'd seen the night before. Police searched the building top to bottom. Dogs were brought in. Forensics swept every crevice. But the library offered no answers. The place was too old, too full of hidden corners and secret alcoves. The boiler room had walls that hadn't been touched in decades. Entire sub-basements mapped only in crumbling blueprints. No one ever found out what happened to her. The town mourned, of course. Flowers were left on the steps. A plaque was installed beside the entrance, in memory of Eleanor Voss, Keeper of Stories, 1962 to 1997. But people moved on, eventually. Yet here I was, seeing her 3 nights in a row. Each night, the same routine. Same green cardigan. Same quiet presence. Always alone. Always after hours. Always shelving books in that same strange, nonsensical way. The last night I saw her, before I really started digging, was the first time I noticed something else. She never left. I would check every door at closing, every aisle, every stairwell. No sign of her leaving the building. But when I opened the library the next morning, the cart was gone, and some of the books were back where they didn't belong. She was still working, still clocked in, still putting books in the wrong places long after she should have been gone. And the weirdest part, no one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they just didn't want to. After that 3rd night, I stopped pretending it wasn't real. I'd gone into this job expecting dust, routine, and maybe the occasional small-town oddity. What I didn't expect was to be watching the same dead woman shelve books every night like she never got the memo. I told myself I wasn't going to look into it, that it wasn't my problem. But even as I tried to focus on the day-to-day, the alphabetizing, the returns, the copier that only worked if you kicked it twice and whispered sweet nothings, I kept finding myself wandering into the back office, pretending to tidy, pretending to look for toner or a paperclip, when in reality, I was drawn to one cabinet. It was a squat, rusted file cabinet shoved into the corner like someone hoped it would be forgotten. The bottom drawer didn't open unless you pulled it just right, lift, then tug, then slide. The folders inside were ancient. Curling edges, brittle manila tabs, the scent of mildew and long-dead mothballs clinging to the paper like a warning. Most were mundane, old timesheets, policies typed on actual typewriters, shift rotations from the 1970s. And then I found her. The folder was marked in fading black ink. Voss staff. It was thicker than the others. I opened it on the break room table with hands that suddenly didn't feel steady. Her staff photo was clipped to the front page. A younger version of the woman I'd been watching from behind the stacks. Same bun, same eyes that looked directly at the camera, but somehow past it at the same time. The kind of look that settled in your bones and made you think of unfinished sentences. The rest of the folder was made up of evaluations, commendations, records of long shifts logged without complaint. A few faded post-it notes with scribbles about her shelving style. Personal system, odd but effective, and one unsigned note, scrawled in red ink, prefers to close. Beneath all of that, tucked into a plastic sleeve where most staff had their W-4s and emergency contact info, was a single folded sheet of paper. Yellowed, torn at one edge, handwritten in a shaky script I didn't recognize. No date, no name, just one sentence. If she comes back, don't follow her. I read it 3 times. It felt like the kind of sentence that shouldn't exist unless something terrible had already happened. A warning too specific to be abstract. Someone had written it and filed it away, hoping no one would ever need to read it again. I should have stopped then, closed the folder, refiled it, walked away, but it was already too late for that. That night, she came back. I had started staying later, volunteering to cover the last shifts, justifying it to myself as professional curiosity, or maybe morbid obsession. I didn't really know anymore. I only knew that when she showed up, I couldn't look away. She appeared like always, no announcement, no footsteps, just there, standing in the 500s aisle, cart full of books, placing volumes on his shelves like the world depended on it. I should have been used to her by now, but this time, something was different. She wasn't just shelving at random. There was direction in her movement, intent. She didn't linger like before or loop back and forth along the same row. She was headed toward the back, the place staff had been told not to go. The basement level, the restricted section. The sign was old, nailed into the wooden door frame. Black letters on tarnished brass. Archive access, staff only, structural risk beyond this point. The area had been sealed off after an inspection 10 years ago found cracks in the foundation and signs of water damage. Supposedly, no one ever talked about it much. It was just the off-limits part of the library. Every old building had one. Eleanor didn't seem to care. She pushed her cart straight through the hallway, down the slope toward the double doors at the bottom. I followed, feet moving before I made the decision. I told myself I was just making sure she didn't get hurt. Even in death, my brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. The basement hallway was darker than usual. The lights overhead buzzed as I passed, some flickering in and out. The temperature dropped in an almost deliberate way, like a tide pulling back before a wave. My breath steamed faintly in the air. She reached the doors without slowing. They were supposed to be locked, but they swung open at her touch. She disappeared inside. The doors started to close behind her. I couldn't stop myself. I reached out, caught the edge of the door, and stepped over the threshold. The second my foot hit the floor inside, everything changed. The lights above flared to full brightness, then blinked out. A moment of total darkness followed, the kind that settles not just over your eyes, but under your skin. Then the bulbs began to flicker erratically, as if caught between two frequencies, and the books started to fall. Not just one or two, not the random sound of a misbalanced stack tipping over, but a cascade, a rain of hardcovers and paperbacks tumbling from shelves on either side of me. Thuds echoed in the silence, sharp cracks against the linoleum. Some landed upright, others spilled open, their pages splayed like broken wings. They weren't falling randomly. They were falling in patterns, as if something was guiding them. The shelves groaned as though under pressure, the air thick with the scent of dust and old glue. I took a step forward, and the ground beneath my feet vibrated. A low, pulsing hum started, so deep I felt it more than heard it. Somewhere in the stacks ahead, something shifted, something heavy, something that moved like it remembered the rhythm of footsteps, but had forgotten why. Panic bloomed. I stepped back. Another book flew from the shelf beside me, narrowly missing my shoulder. The hum grew louder. The bulbs above began to flicker and sink, on off, like a heartbeat stuttering against reality. I turned and fled. The door didn't want to open. For a moment, I was sure it wouldn't. I'd be trapped down there, swallowed whole by the library's forgotten wing. But then the handle turned with a shuddering click, and I stumbled through, back into the main hallway. As I crossed the threshold, the lights stabilized. The hum stopped. The air warmed. I turned to look back, heart still thudding in my chest. The doors were closed. Locked. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. Eleanor never came back out. She had entered the basement like it was part of her route, like she belonged there. And then she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car until the sun rose, engine idling, the sounds of distant birds muffled by the ringing in my ears. When I finally returned the next day, I noticed the cart was missing. The same one she always used. The one with the chipped wheel and the faint smell of lavender and mold. Later, when I asked about the restricted section, casually, trying not to sound too invested, I was told it hadn't been opened in over a decade. No one had a key anymore. Not since the last renovation that never happened. That might have been the end of it. But the next night, the cart was back. Empty. Parked right outside the basement doors. I stopped trying to rationalize what was happening after the cart came back. It was waiting for me, positioned neatly in front of the basement doors, the same way someone might leave a suitcase by the front door before a trip. There were no books inside, only a single yellowing checkout slip wedged between the metal bars. The slip was blank. No taites. No names. No due date. I stared at it longer than I should have, heart thudding with the kind of dread that doesn't announce itself, just coils there, heavy and sour. After that night, the library changed. Or maybe I changed, and the library simply responded in kind. Either way, something started to bleed through the quiet. The silence I had once found peaceful began to feel more like a vacuum, something designed to pull at the edges of sanity. It began with whispers, soft at first, barely there. At closing time, when I was alone among the shelves, I would catch faint snatches of sound, fragments of book titles, muttered in a voice like brittle paper scraping across stone. Names, numbers, Dewey classifications recited with the rhythm of prayer. I tried chalking it up to my nerves, to sleep deprivation or stress. But then the sounds grew louder, clearer. I heard the unmistakable clunk of the date stamp. Once, twice, 3 times in a row, echoing from an empty reference desk long after I'd turned off the lights. There was scents, too. The usual aroma of dust and old leather began to shift, souring into something more visceral. A thick staleness like mildew and rotting cloth. And beneath it all, a sharper scent, metallic and wet, like iron left out in the rain too long. I started keeping the windows open when I could, but the air never truly cleared. The library had begun to sweat its secrets. I couldn't stay away, though. Something about Eleanor, about what she had become, demanded understanding. So I started digging. Dunsmuir wasn't the kind of place that updated its records very often. Most of the town's archives were stored in an annex of the town hall, a converted firehouse now filled with sagging filing cabinets and curling microfilm. I began going in on my off days, telling myself I was looking into library renovation dates. But in truth, I was chasing ghosts. What I found wasn't one story. It was a series, disjointed, quiet, conveniently forgotten. People who had vanished over the years, always on foot, always within a few blocks of the library. Their names trickled across newspaper clippings and missing persons reports. A retired teacher in 1983, a high school senior in 1991, a traveling insurance agent in 2002, a college student in 2010. No connections, no patterns except one, all last seen near or inside Dunsmuir Public Library. It was as if the building had teeth. Further back, I uncovered a town ledger, handwritten, brittle with age, and tucked in the pages was the beginning of a truth Dunsmuir had chosen to forget. The library, it turned out, was never meant to be a library. Before the stone foundation was laid, before the stained glass and reading nooks and dusty shelves, the site had been home to something else entirely, a 19th century asylum. One of the old ones before regulations, when treatment meant containment. It had been small, private, a place for the excessively troubled. The kind of institution where families could send away inconvenient relatives and call it mercy. Most of it had been demolished in the early 1900s, but not all of it. The basement, according to the records, was part of the original structure. It had served as the solitary confinement wing. Soundproof, reinforced. Its layout had been absorbed into the blueprint of the new building, but never fully explored. I read the words again and again, each time feeling like my stomach was filling with ice. Solitary confinement. No wonder the basement didn't feel right. No wonder the air down there was wrong, heavy with pressure, humming with some residual frequency like an echo still reverberating in unseen corners. It wasn't just structurally unstable. It was saturated. The records noted a renovation in the 1990s, funding from a historical society, intentions to restore and modernize. But the work had been abandoned halfway through. Complaints from contractors, equipment that failed, workers who refused to return after reporting strange sound from behind sealed walls. And then there was a name, Eleanor Voss. Only, she didn't appear on the official staff rosters until the early 90s. Before that, there was no employment record, no certifications, no references, just a sudden presence. First noted by co-workers as eager to assist, unusually devoted, insistent on her role. I went back to the personnel file I'd found, looked at the dates. The timeline didn't match. If Eleanor had worked there for decades, As the older librarians believed, why was her staff record only a few years long? The answer came in a short column buried in an 1891 newspaper archive. A line about a young woman committed to the Dunsmuir Sanatorium after a psychological break. She'd been discovered living in the local library, sneaking in at night, pretending to work there during the day. When finally confronted, she'd insisted she was the head librarian and accused the actual staff of trying to undo her cataloging. No name was printed in the article, but it didn't need to be. A staff photo in the archive confirmed it. Grainy, faded, but unmistakable, Eleanor's face. The same sharp chin, the same hollowed eyes. She had existed a century before her so-called employment. She had been a patient, a delusional woman who believed she belonged in the very building that would one day be razed over her prison. The realization hit like a punch. She hadn't died in 1997. She had already been dead, decades before. Or worse, she had never really died at all. There were no records of her release, no death certificate, no burial plot, but a note had been scrawled on the bottom of one renovation ledger, scribbled hastily in the margin, barely legible. It read, "Wall breach, found remains. Likely animal. Seal back up." The page was dated 3 days before construction was halted. I didn't want to believe it, but the puzzle pieces clicked together with cruel precision. Eleanor hadn't vanished in 1997. She'd been found, trapped behind a forgotten wall, bones crumpled in a work uniform, her cart beside her, as if she'd simply walked into the stacks one day and never returned. Buried alive, entombed beneath the library she believed was hers. They never told anyone, never reported it, just resealed the wall and scrubbed her name off the records. But Eleanor didn't leave. Not really. She stayed. As Cart, as Whisper, as Presence. Her identity etched into the foundations of the place. Convinced, even in death, that she still worked there. That she still had a job to finish. And somewhere deep beneath the stacks, I knew she was still shelving. Still walking her silent rounds through the corridors of a place that forgot her. But the library remembered. And now so did I. I returned to the basement on a night when the air felt too still, like the entire library was holding its breath. The doors didn't open easily. They were locked again, same rusted handle, same warped wood, but I came prepared. A crowbar from a maintenance closet, the kind kept around for prying open broken drawers or crates of outdated textbooks. I slipped it between the frame and the door and leaned my weight into it. The wood groaned like it hadn't been disturbed in years, even though I knew otherwise. When it gave, it did so suddenly, and I stumbled forward into the dark. The air hit me like a slap, thick with decay, and something else, something dry and old, like the inside of an abandoned mausoleum. The lights above flickered when I found the switch, but only a few responded. The rest buzzed once and died, casting long shadows that bent in strange angles across the warped floorboards. Dust blanketed everything. Not just the usual layer that settles in neglected places, but thick clots of it, like it had been growing, like it was alive. Some of it had congealed into the shape of footprints, forming a trail deeper into the basement, where the shelves began to lean and split from rot. And then I saw the stains. They weren't fresh. The color had long since turned from red to brown, seeping into the cracks between floorboards and into the base of the lower shelves. The blood had dried in looping arcs, as though someone had struggled here, or been dragged. Something stirred deep in my gut, old instinct screaming under a surface gone too quiet. I pressed on, toward the back wall, where an ancient wooden cabinet squatted beneath a collapsed fluorescent fixture. A library card catalog, the kind most patrons overlooked these days in favor of digital databases. But here it still stood like an altar, its drawers crooked, some jammed open, others sealed tight with time. One of them caught my attention. It was pulled halfway out. Inside, instead of index cards, there was only one thing. A torn library card, brittle and curled at the edges. In faded ink, barely legible under a layer of grime. Someone had written a message. The handwriting was jagged, like it had been carved more than penned. Property of Eleanor Voss. Do not reshelve. I held it in my hand for too long. I could feel the weight of it, disproportionate to its size. It pulsed with something, not heat exactly, but memory, like holding an artifact of a life too stubborn to end. The floor beneath the cabinet creaked as I shifted, and that's when I noticed the books. Hundreds of them, scattered in every direction, their spines cracked open like ribs, pages yellow and warped with age. At first glance, it looked like a random mess, fallen shelves, careless placement. But it wasn't. There was intention in the arrangement. I stepped back, looked from above. The books were forming a pattern. Not an image, but a language. A code. Dewey Decimal numbers. Lined spine to spine in rows that arced across the dust-caked floor. I traced them silently, moving from title to title, each number slotting in a place like part of an equation I hadn't realized I was solving. It spelled something. A name. My name. Not just the first or last, but the full thing. Middle initial included. The exact way it had appeared on the paperwork I'd filled out when I was hired. That was when the lights overhead went out. Every one of them. I was buried in blackness, so thick it pressed against my skin like wet cloth. Somewhere in the dark, I heard the soft rustle of pages turning. Slowly, precisely. Then came the footsteps. Not loud, just the bare scrape of shoes over wood. Slow, deliberate, moving closer. I didn't breathe. Couldn't. The sound grew until it stopped beside me. I smelled lavender and mildew, the scent of old paper, the burn of rusted metal. Then the hand closed around my wrist. It wasn't cold like I expected. It was warm, clammy and wrong, like the skin of something pulled from a flooded basement. The grip was firm, but didn't tighten. And then I felt the pressure. A sharp, hot sting on my inner wrist. Not sharp like a blade, but blunt, forceful. The feeling of something being stamped. The pain bloomed like fire. I tried to pull away, but the grip held fast. I stumbled back, gasping, blinking into the dark, but my vision swam. My wrist felt like it had been branded. When I looked down, I saw it. Faint but unmistakable. Letters rising in red, angry skin. Overdue. The pain intensified. Something in my skull screamed. Not in fear, but in recognition. Like some part of me understood, deep down, that I had crossed a threshold I was never meant to. That I had trespassed into a system far older than this library. Far more brutal than paper cuts and late fees. My knees buckled. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Eleanor's face. She was standing over me, just beside the rows of fallen books. Her cardigan hung heavy with dust, her hands mottled and translucent in the flicker of the emergency light behind her. She didn't blink, didn't move, but she was smiling. And then everything vanished. He woke to silence. A deep, swallowing kind of silence that didn't feel like absence but insulation, thick, padded, too perfect. The kind of quiet that made him feel like he was still dreaming or underwater or worse. The room was dim, lit only by a single hanging bulb that hummed faintly above a desk covered in old paper slips and cracked leather-bound logs. Dust floated in the stale air, catching the faint light like falling ash. The walls were lined with shelves that sagged beneath the weight of ancient volumes. Books bound in unfamiliar textures, their titles faded to nothing. He stood slowly. His limbs ached with stiffness, like he'd been asleep far too long, and his head throbbed with something deeper than pain, an echo or a hum that wasn't entirely physical. It took time before he realized what was missing. There was no door. Where there should have been a hallway, there was only solid wall. No hinges, no seams, no suggestion that anything had ever opened or closed. Just smooth stone, darker in patches, and warm to the touch in a way that suggested breath behind it. No windows, no clock, no way to track time. The small black phone on the desk was dead. No dial tone, no reception. Just a prop from a forgotten decade. He wandered through the archive room in slow, hesitant loops. The books were arranged haphazardly, but not without purpose. He could feel patterns in their placement, repetitions of symbols, rhythms and spine color, sequences that hinted at design. Not just stored information, but something curated, something meant to be preserved. His own thoughts moved sluggishly, like wading through syrup. Time passed. How much, he couldn't say. He slept in bursts, sometimes on the floor, sometimes in the worn leather chair that creaked like it had been waiting for him. He ate nothing, drank nothing, yet the gnawing of hunger never arrived. Only the slow, steady corrosion of purpose, or memory. He began to hear sounds, muffled at first, footsteps above, the soft thud of chairs scooting back from tables, the murmur of conversation in distant reading rooms, pages turning, the distant rhythmic beep of books being checked out. Sometimes he heard laughter. Once, he heard his own name, spoken just faintly enough to make him doubt it. A patron asking a question. A co-worker calling down the stairs. Familiar voices. Names he couldn't quite remember. No one came. He shouted once. Pounded on the walls. It made no difference. The sounds above never paused. He might as well have been in a snow globe. Sealed. Preserved. Displayed. He found the mirror by accident. Tucked behind a row of archival drawers. Cracked down the center like a hairline fracture in time itself. He froze when he saw his reflection. The man staring back was older. Much older. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and deep grooves ran from the corners of his eyes down his cheeks. His skin looked papery, like the surface of an overread novel. His eyes were glassy with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from sleep deprivation, but from permanence. The realization didn't come all at once. It began when he powered on the ancient computer at the far corner of the room. The screen flickered to life, groaned through its boot process, and landed on a login he somehow knew by heart. He navigated the archaic interface like he'd been doing it for years. The staff directory was under system management. The list was short. A few familiar names. Marilyn, the head librarian, Paul from circulation, Louise from children's programs. And then there was his. Position, archivist. Hire date, April 1997. Clients, permanent staff. Notes, night shift only. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, stuttering rush. He leaned away from the monitor like it had struck him. None of it made sense. Except it did. Pieces clicked into place, cruel and seamless. The conversations that ended when he entered the room. The hollow looks when he mentioned Eleanor. The way everyone had hesitated, then moved on like they'd forgotten her the moment she was out of sight. The library made people forget. That was the trick. It didn't haunt in the usual ways. It revised. It edited. It cataloged reality until it made sense, and what didn't fit was quietly redacted, erased, or shelved somewhere deeper. He wasn't the new guy. He was a replacement. Eleanor had never truly left. She'd simply been misplaced, misfiled in the system. And when the space she occupied finally collapsed, when the silence she kept began to leak into the waking world, the library adjusted. It filled the gap. With him. And now he was here, a man with no beginning, no exit, and no sense of how long he'd been behind the walls. The whispers returned. Not voices anymore, but the flutter of pages, the shifting of footfalls in aisles that shouldn't exist. The sound of shelving carts gliding across hardwood. He stood by the edge of the stacks, the cracked mirror behind him. A warmth bloomed in his chest. Not comfort, not fear, but something simpler. A recognition. A purpose long forgotten, now clicking back into alignment. He stepped forward. Somewhere far above, he heard the front door open. Footsteps echoed in the lobby. A hesitant rhythm. The sound of someone unfamiliar with the space, taking in the scent of old books and polished wood for the first time. The new hire. Another college dropout. Another quiet job. Another curiosity waiting to be ignited. He could feel it, all of it, like a script repeating itself. His lips curled slowly into a smile. The first of weeks? Months? Years? It didn't matter. The cart waited at the end of the aisle, already stocked. It was time to shelve,